He was a visionary. He could read the signs of the times, but he wasn't only a visionary, he was also a strategist.
Now they say of a prophet, the true prophet is one who loves the nation. And that's what I believe he was, somebody who loved the nation.
Remember, he came under a lot of criticism from within the church as well. He came under a lot of criticism from other Christians. His whole philosophy was that you could not be in the church and be blinded by what was happening around you.
His outreach to make people aware any form of racism, any form of stigma, was not just against the person or the group, but it was against God himself.
When we got the dialogue with the ANC leadership, there were 3 questions that Archbishop Hurley put to them. One of them was, you talk about nationalizing the mines and the industries. Where are you going to get the people who are going to be able to run them?
Where the Spirit is, there is freedom. Chose that motto. He could see that that's what South Africa needed, was freedom for people.
Not only the youngest ordained bishop in the world at the time, not only the youngest ordained archbishop in the world at the time, Denis Eugene Hurley, born on November the 9th, 1915 in Cape Town, was not only renowned for his fiery, forceful fight against darkness, but also his glow of warmth and compassion.
His parents were both Irish, and they came out to South Africa towards the end of the last century, and that was a very important influence on him. The Irish sense of persecution by the British, and the sense of struggling for independence, struggling for freedom, was kind of in the DNA, I think, of Hurley. His father, of course, was a lighthouse keeper and had been doing that job for some time, quite a solitary, isolated kind of existence, far away from town. The first lighthouse they came to was at Cape Point, and one evening when they were saying prayers, he said, I think the light has gone out. And it was just a mischievous thing, and his father was so furious with him. This idea of the light going out was not on. But so he had that powerful experience of light and the significance of light in saving lives.
Uncle Denis was our Uncle Denis. He was, there was always great excitement if he came to visit the family. He was a big man. We loved him. He had that clear, distinctive voice and laugh. He was fun. As we grew older, we became more and more aware of Uncle Denis's role in the political world and also in the church. We were the younger cousins, and I don't remember too much conversation, but we were certainly aware of the role Uncle Denis was playing in the church and in South Africa at that time.
There were 2 incidents that stand out during his high school years that could have contributed to his selfless resolve to a life of piousness and serving. Firstly, he was lost in a cave for about 24 hours whilst on a school picnic in Newcastle. The second was when his father became mentally ill, and the family was helped by the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, a Roman Catholic community of priests and brothers.
So Denis went to the boys' school and Eileen to the girls' school in the same town. In that high school year, he was lost in a cave with 2 other boys for just under a day. It was, there was a picnic, and all the boys went on the picnic, and they were allowed to go. Some went climbing rocks, and some were playing games and so on. When lunch came, everybody noticed that there were 3 boys missing, and they kept shouting every now and then, but nobody heard them. And they were praying, and evidently at that time Denis Hurley said that if they got out alive, he would become a priest. What saved them was the fact that Denis Hurley had borrowed a hat from somebody else for that day. And as he entered the cave, he took off the hat and left it there so that it wouldn't be knocked about in the cave, because it's a small space, and if you've got a hat on, it's going to be a nuisance. And shortly after that, his father had a kind of mental breakdown and had to go, away for treatment for about 18 months. And the mother then was left with 4 children, 3 boys and a girl, all at school. She had no job. They had no house because they always lived in the lighthouse, whatever accommodation was provided for the lighthouse keeper. And they only had the father's pension as a boarded, medically boarded person. So it was an extremely difficult time. And I think something else that kind of made Denis Hurley mature much faster, that now in some way he was responsible now to help with this family, and an experience of poverty.
With a commitment to take up a priestly life, he was sent overseas for studies, which he completed in Rome, the heart of the global Roman Catholic Empire.
Immediately after he finished his matric, he went to Ireland for his novitiate as a member of the Oblates of Mary Immaculate. And he was there for about just under 2 years. And at the end of that, he thought he would be going into the next step, which is called the scholasticate. That's the time when they actually do the priestly studies. But a message came from the bishop here, Bishop Henry de Lisle, his predecessor, to say, I want him to go to Rome.
Archbishop Hurley was one of the first of the South Africans to go and study overseas to become an oblate priest. In that process, he undergoes this conversion. So he was really one of the first whites among the clergy, I would believe, who had gone through that process. So when he came back from France and Rome, where he was studying, he already had a very different outlook.
It was an extremely challenging experience because simultaneously they had all the lectures were in Latin. The language of the house, of the institution, was French, and the language that you had to speak if you went out in the streets and you wanted to understand anything that was going on in town was Italian. And another thing that had a profound influence on him was the Mussolini and his fascist, they were called black shirts. Everybody, all the followers of Mussolini wore black shirts, even the little children. And the way they treated the ordinary Italians in the streets and wherever they went rang a bell. He said, that is how we treat black people in South Africa. There was something else happening in Rome at that time which I think made an impact, and that is the the young Christian workers. It was a movement started in the 1920s in Belgium, and in the 30s, that's when Hurley was studying in Rome in the 1930s, everybody was talking about it. It wasn't in their curriculum, they weren't studying it, but there were talks about the young Christian workers and their methodology. And their methodology is to come together in small groups once a week and to do an exercise which is called See, Judge, Act. Hurley said that is the perfect method for bringing about change. And it's just so simple. See, judge, act.
Hurley was very impressed by the young Christian workers who were beginning to make an impact on the church. These impressions proved significant in his later years. With the outbreak of the Second World War, Hurley returned to Durban in July 1940, beginning his long association with the cathedral.
He was appointed here. This was the first place he came to, Emmanuel Cathedral, as the junior, very much the junior priest on the staff.
I first met Father Denis Hurley in 1940. He was a chaplain to the school that I attended, Morris Brothers, and he was a curate here at the cathedral, and he looked after the school. He was a chaplain to the school, and he heard my first confession. He gave me my first communion in October 1940, and it had been a long, long association with him. He was a great son of the church. He loved the church. He loved the church, and he was an excellent clergyman. But if he had to speak up, he was never frightened to speak, as he did in the apartheid era, against the government, against apartheid, against separation. Sometimes he was a lone voice crying in the Catholic wilderness.
He often bespeaks a man who was solidly rooted in his spirituality, didn't ever waver from that, but was able then to express it in a way that made an impact on the world. And that for me is perhaps the best example. It's a Christ-like example, and maybe that's the best way, the incarnate Christ in different places. And that for me was Archbishop Denis Hurley in many ways.
He was a visionary. He could read the signs of the times, but he wasn't only a visionary, he was also a strategist. He had a vision, an ideal, and the first thing he would say is, how do you put that into practice?
They say of a prophet, the true prophet is one who loves the nation, and that's what I believe he was. Somebody who loved the nation, and therefore had to stand up when things were going wrong.
The Pope of that time, Pope Pius XI, who was quite a fiery kind of person, and he was very angry with Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin, and he wrote, the kind of encyclical letters that popes write about these three movements, Nazism and communism and the fascism of Italy. And that was a very, it was a strong influence for Hurley to see the church speaking out about the way people were being treated. And interestingly, in that same place that we were studying, the Gregorian University, was Oscar Romero, a bishop from Central America, from El Salvador, who was shot while he was saying Mass because of his stand for human rights and justice for the people in El Salvador.
At the end of 1946, when he was just 31, Hurley was the youngest Catholic bishop in the world. As he went about the parishes, he heard how much suffering there was as a result of South Africa's racial policies. It took him quite a long time to persuade the other bishops that they should jointly speak out against the many injustices prevalent in South African society. The years that followed saw Hurley invest all his resources within the church and the internal changes it could make.
See, judge, act. You talk about what you see in society, and then judge what you think about it. What do the scriptures say about that? What does the gospel say about it? And then act, what are we going to do about it?
It was only after Hurley became an archbishop in 1951, again he was the youngest in the world, that he was able to persuade the bishops to make their first joint statement against racial discrimination. And the 1950s marked a time when the church took a stand against this growing injustice.
He was one of those persons who would be certainly put in the group of progressive, or looking for what would be the best way to bring the church into line with in its teaching, but also the way it expresses that teaching, in line with what people of today can understand and can accept. And at the same time, be won over to understanding that the Christian teaching has particular things that you need to change your life in order to fit into it.
And I think Archbishop Tutu recognized, he said, before I came onto the scene, there was another man. And that man was Archbishop Hurley, who spoke up for the oppressed people. And that's perfectly true. And a very, very balanced character. Very, very, very balanced. He didn't have extreme views. He always listened to both sides and then acted. He was very decisive. When he acted decisively.
By 1957, a major joint statement about apartheid, largely written by Hurley, described apartheid as intrinsically evil, the strongest possible condemnation in Catholicism.
I worked with the Archbishop as a young journalist in private sector, in the media industry, but through my involvement in the